Hi there, this is Josh again here at All Flutes Plus in London, and today what I want to talk to you about is all of these different features on flutes. And I know it can be very confusing if you're buying a flute for your child. What do all these things mean? Offset G versus inline G, and open holes and closed hole, and a split E mechanism or no split E mechanism, or a C sharp trill key. Don't worry, I'm going to explain to you what all of those things are. The most common differences that you will see immediately between flutes, especially in the beginner category, is open holes versus closed holes. And all that means is that there are 5 keys on the flute for the second and third fingers of the left hand and the first through third fingers of the right hand that rest on keys that can have a hole in the middle of them or not. This particular flute that I'm holding does not have holes in the keys, so we would call it a closed hole flute. There generally is not a difference in price, although sometimes there is. When you decide to resell the flute further down the line, an open hole flute will sell faster than a closed hole flute, and usually for closer to what you paid for it. A closed hole flute does not have a noticeably different sound from an open hole flute. So really, it all comes down to personal preference. Closed hole keys are great for people who have small hands, who might have a difficulty covering the open hole, such as children. They're also a really great option for people with mobility issues, such as people who might have arthritis in their hands. As you can see, I completely straightened my fingers and it still works. So it doesn't really matter where you put your finger on the key, the note will still come out. This flute that I'm holding, as you can see, has open holes. And so you can see in these 5 keys that we talked about, there are holes in the middle of the key. And another big advantage of having an open hole flute is that it does encourage proper hand positioning. You can't get lazy with your fingers because you'll open the hole a little bit. You'll crack the hole and the note will crack, or it won't come out at all. So it does encourage holding the flute properly. Open hole flutes, once you reach sort of a more advanced stage in your flute playing, give you some extra options for fine-tuning certain notes, especially in the high register, up in the 3rd octave. You can close just the ring of an open hole. For example, it makes the top F sharp much easier to produce, and it makes it a much purer sound. If you play a lot of contemporary music, you can slide your finger slowly off of the open hole to create special effects or microtones. One of the other options on flutes that can be very confusing to people is the difference between an inline G and an offset G. What that refers to is the note that is played by your 3rd finger on your left hand, which is the G. On an inline G flute, you will see that the 2 keys right here are directly in a straight line with each other. On an offset G flute, you can see it's rotated quite a bit towards the front of the instrument. Offset, one might say. The offset G makes it much easier for people who have a short 3rd finger to play the flute. So on an inline G flute, it does sort of force the left hand to be a little bit more turned in towards the flute, and a bit more of a curvature in the finger is necessary to cover the hole. For some people, this tiny, it's a matter of a centimeter maybe, if that, but it can prove a really big stretch for some people, especially children. Whereas on an offset G flute, the key is much closer to the hand, and so it allows the left hand to have a much more relaxed position while playing and still maintaining proper hand position and curvature of the fingers. In England and in America, an offset G is by a huge margin the more popular option these days on flutes, but there are 2 extra posts on the flute to hold the key for the offset G. So it does add a tiny bit of weight to the instrument, but as it's in the center of the instrument, it actually sort of helps balance it out a little better. I personally very much prefer an offset G, but can play either. And in the resale market, if you ever decide down the line that you're going to sell your flute on, it is much easier to sell an offset G flute quickly in today's market than it would be an inline G flute. Another choice that you will often see when you are shopping for a flute that can be confusing to some people is the term split E mechanism, sometimes just called the split E or just the E mechanism. And what that is a little bar that you'll see on a flute that has it right here. And what that does is it literally splits these two keys, which on a flute that doesn't have the mechanism, work together. But on a flute with a split E, when you press down the middle finger on your right hand, see this key moves. And what that does is it makes it much easier to produce the E above high C. You did possibly notice that the second time I played that E towards the end of the phrase, there was a tiny little chirp at the beginning of the note. And that is exactly the sort of thing that the split E mechanism can eliminate from happening. But I do also feel that without the split E mechanism, you do get a more homogeneous sound of the E in regards to the notes around it. But really it's personal preference. It also is worth noting that because there is a whole extra mechanism that's added to the flute, a flute with a split E mechanism will weigh more than a flute without one. So that can be an issue for some people who perhaps have arthritis or need a very light flute. And the final thing we're going to discuss when it comes to flute terminology when you're buying a new flute is a C foot versus a B foot. All that really means is how low can the flute play? On a flute that has a C foot, you'll see that there are two keys here on what is called the foot joint of the flute, which means the flute plays down to middle C on the piano as its lowest note. If you see an extra key on the foot joint here for a total of 3, that will give you the B natural below that C. What this does is it adds extra tubing to the flute that can make it much easier to produce certain pitches very high in the range of the flute, and it also adds sort of a little bit of richness and darkness to the sound of the flute because it makes the instrument a little bit heavier. Conversely, if you are a 5-year-old or a person with perhaps a shoulder problem, you don't want a heavy flute, and a C foot is a perfect option. Another term you see often when you're flute shopping related to flutes that have a B foot is the gizmo key. It's a very funny term, but the gizmo key refers to this tiny little touch piece here on a B foot, and what that does is independently closes the low B key. This is also sometimes called the high C facilitator, and that's exactly what it does. By closing just the B key on a B foot flute, enables the flutist to produce a very responsive and solid top C on the flute. So hopefully you found that informative, and it has taken a lot of the mystery out of some of these terms that you come across when you are looking for a flute. If you have any further questions about these instruments, feel free to contact the team at AFP. They're lovely people at afp@allflutesplus.co.uk, or you can just find them on the web at allflutesplus.com. Don't forget to follow their Instagram page at allflutesplus. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.